Jake Levine here. My guest on this second episode was Dr. Adam Bresnick, my favorite English teacher from high school, the Collegiate School in New York City. Because I know Dr. Bresnick well and attended the school at which he's taught for 27 years, I wanted to provide some background to our conversation to make sure that it is accessible to everyone, including those who did not attend my high school or those who have no idea why we'd be discussing what books he feels he can and cannot teach. Over the last several years, and especially the last few months, there have been cultural shifts around what ideas are and are not acceptable and where reasonable expressions of free speech end and potentially harmful discourse begins. While the debates surrounding these issues can be fruitful, they too often fall prey to what Dr. Bresnick referred to as reductionist thinking. Surely, anyone who hears this can recall a time in recent memory where a work of art, book, or idea that was previously seen as anodyne was deemed unfit for consumption, often seemingly out of nowhere. Because Dr. Bresnick is no stranger to controversial texts, having taught Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita for many years, I thought he'd be a great person to talk to about all of this. He had a lot to say, and what resulted was a fascinating conversation about the merits of a humanities education, how we should understand difficult texts and ideas, and the role of educators. As an additional contextual note, one of the specific books we discuss is Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which stopped being taught after an open letter from a group of students called for a re-examination of its place in the ninth grade curriculum. It was a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Three, two, one, and we're live. Dr. Bresnick, thank you very much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you. So, as we were just discussing before we started recording, you're a guy who's been at Collegiate. You've been an English teacher for 27 years, almost 30 now. I would guess that you're a guy who's pretty much seen it all, except even for you, the new landscape of the coronavirus world and just teaching on Zoom must be pretty crazy.
Yeah, well, again, Zoom teaching has caused lots of problems for lots of people. I think in some ways I've been a little bit fortunate with this because the students that we have at the school are pretty talented. They're pretty serious. They want to do the work. And, the biggest thing, Jake, is that we have small classrooms. So, a Zoom classroom, remote classroom, if you've got, let's say 14, 15 kids at the most, on a computer screen, which I'm looking at right now, you'd have 16 little boxes. You can actually in some ways create the illusion of a class. You don't end up with the lateral things going on from student to student. You don't end up with as much creativity. You certainly don't end up with as much wildness as you could have in a normal class. In part because everybody's just sitting and, people are pretty circumscribed and you can't read people's body language the same way. You don't know exactly, how to, you have less information coming, if that makes sense, But by the same token, you can have a conversation. So one thing that I was thinking all spring is that if this had happened 5 years ago, it would have been totally unfeasible. But in fact, it proved to be for English teaching at the high school level, in an independent school with kids who are pretty serious and pretty committed, it proved to be pretty good. When I talk to my colleagues who have very big classes, there's a guy called Dan Meiselman who taught in the middle school at Collegiate years and years and years ago. He now teaches science up at Scarsdale. And he teaches in a public school, much like the school I went to, but he's got 30, 35 kids in a class. And so when you have that many people, I just don't know how it's possible really to have a class on Zoom. And he said it proved to be pretty much impossible because you have to be toggling between two screens, very difficult to keep kids on point. It's a very reduced kind of teaching. And it ends up being, Jake, a lot more informational. Teaching's funny because on the one hand, there's a body of knowledge that you want to give. There's information that you have to impart. Undoubtedly, part of what you do as a teacher is covering the material. But I would argue that the most interesting parts of teaching actually happen outside of that. Excursions, improvisations, jokes, riffs, all kinds of interactions that spark thinking that you didn't actually even expect. I always say if I come into a class and nothing surprising happens, the class is a failure, right? So if we think about, I think one of the problems with online education in general is that people are thinking of education as purely informational. And, again, if you want to get information, the internet's great. if you want to have experiences, full human experiences that really stimulate the mind and appeal to something more than just a kind of catalog of facts, well, it gets a little hard, and that's why I really do worry. I have to say, I worry across the country that I think if we really have a full year of Zoom teaching, across the country,
Yeah.
we're going to lose an incredible amount of teaching. I mean, that's what's going to happen. I mean, we're just gonna have like a real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, like you said, I obviously, for anyone who would listen to this and doesn't know, I obviously went to Collegiate as well. Collegiate, small, all boys private school in New York City. Your typical class, you'd say, is what, maybe 13, 14, 15 students?
That's right.
Yeah. And so I could totally see what you're saying, that in larger settings, because I have two brothers who are in college right now. And I was kind of wondering myself, if you're in Econ 101 or Computer Science 101 with 200 people, I don't know how you could even hold a video lecture.
Yeah, well, lectures are different, Jake, because look, the thing about a lecture is a performance in which you really are imparting a lot of information, right? Lectures are different from seminars, right? So I actually think big lectures online, fine. You can do that. I mean, the introductory stuff. If you got a great economics teacher, I mean, you're getting the basic concepts. And again, the great economics teacher, I mean, a place like Harvard, there might be 500 kids in that lecture, right? I mean, incredible numbers of people, right? So in that sense, look, lectures, fine. I mean, I think lectures are quite doable. It's seminar teaching that becomes complicated, right? Now, again, with a small group, it's doable. A group of 30, it becomes very difficult to have a seminar. So I think what happens is it devolves into a kind of lecture. And again, there's a French critic, this guy Roland Barthes, who I read a lot of in grad school, and he said, the goal of literature, you can say this with teaching as well, that the goal of literature, the goal of teaching is to make the reader into the producer of the text, right? Not the consumer. Sure, we consume the stuff, but it's in the articulation and the engagement that we then produce the text for ourselves, right? So, the idea of a seminar, of course, is that you're actually asking each kid in the class to produce something every day, right? Again, in my classes, if it's not like I keep a tally sheet, but I want to be thinking about making sure that every kid is contributing ideas, that every kid is stimulated, right? Because it's precisely when a kid has a new idea, when something comes up, when a connection is made, then the literature and the entire enterprise of studying literature becomes galvanizing, becomes super interesting for kids, right? And it's very funny, Jake. Again, not to toot my own horn, but I've had so many kids who come in not really liking literature very much, and by the end of the class with me, they're really into it because they come to see that it is actually very interesting, right? And very volatile, and that the meaning isn't. It's not like the meaning is just there. The meaning is always being contended over, right? And being developed and being changed, and that's, I think, one of the reasons that the study of literature is actually so incredibly interesting, right? And it's different from some other disciplines because, as we know, this is one of the difficult things, Jake, and I'm sure you heard me say this, but, literature is weird, right? Because on the one hand, look, there's no right answer, right? I mean, no finally right answer. There's still a lot of wrong answers. So kids come in, it's like, they think, there's no right answer. It means that anything goes, so they're always a little shocked when at the beginning of the year, like, some kid will make some ridiculous claim. And I will just say, well, I think that's totally wrong. And they'll look at me like, how can you say this? But, what's odd about literary study, again, is there are a lot of ways to be right. And there are a lot of ways to advance the understanding of things. And yet, there are also a lot of ways to be wrong. I've been thinking a lot about that. I'll tell you very briefly. I mean, this doesn't have to do with literature; it has to do with history. When I was in high school, and this really does come up now to a lot of debates that are going on. When I was in high school, Jake, I had an AP history class with a fantastic teacher called Ashby Bryson. He was a Southerner. The hero of my class, the hero of that class, the guy who was presented to us as the kind of great apostle of progressive liberalism was Thomas Jefferson, right? Jefferson, when I was in high school, was the man of the left. He was the guy who understood, sort of country life, the agrarian life. He was somebody who had spent a lot of time in France and knew his philosophe, and of course was a fantastic writer. He was presented to us as absolutely the man of the left. Whereas Hamilton was presented to us absolutely as the man of the right, because Hamilton, of course, was the one who wanted to consolidate the bank and wanted to, bring a kind of advanced version of capitalism into the States. And our history teacher, saw him in the way that a 60s kind of hippie would, as a kind of apostle of, the worst kinds of business excess, right? So for me, Hamilton was like the conservative dude. Jefferson was the progressive dude. And, Lin-Manuel Miranda comes along.
Was about to say, yeah.
And it's totally flipped on its head, right? So, now it's like Jefferson, we look at Jefferson, the dude had 600 slaves, okay? 600. I mean, he said all men are created equal, but, 600 slaves, right? And of course, there's the Sally Hemings and all the stuff that's come out. And now we see Hamilton as this kind of extraordinary multi-culti guy who's like from the islands, possibly man of color with a kind of understanding of internationalism and a very, very cosmopolitan sense of finance. And, he now has occupied this the position again of the guy who's sort of, as it were, the progressive on those issues. So my point here, is that what's so interesting about study when you're studying really rich topics is that, the answers are not final. And indeed, the answers may really, really evolve and switch over time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you bring that up because there's a quote that really stuck with me from a colleague of yours, Dr. Russell, who teaches Latin. And I remember she said in an intro to one of her classes that she really hated when students would say, when they would get essay grades that they weren't happy with, they would say, oh, well, you can't tell me I'm wrong. It's just my opinion. To which her response was, well, not all opinions are created equal. And
that's right.
Whenever I would get into that mode myself, when I would get a grade I didn't like or thought that a teacher, they just didn't understand what I was saying, I would have to stop myself and say, well, maybe I just had maybe I was wrong. Maybe my opinion was bad. And
right. And I will say this on the flip side here, Jake, again, one of the things that I think is extraordinarily important, and I wish I could quote the line directly to you, but it's also important for teachers to recognize that they may be wrong, right? Montaigne, who is like my favorite essayist, is Michel Montaigne. I love the guy. And, he talks in his essay, De l'institution des enfants, on the education of children, about how he wants to train a person to debate. And he basically says, look, he wants the person to debate. He wants the young person to debate with full intensity, with full intellectual commitment, really standing for the ideas. But he says to give up an idea and admit that one is wrong when one has been out-debated is not a sign of weakness. He says it's actually a sign of intellectual strength, right? And, I say to the kids, and this really is true, I say at the beginning of the year, I say, look, we're all going to make mistakes, and I'm going to make mistakes too. And if you call me out on my mistakes and you challenge a reading, I want to be flexible enough to say, hey, maybe things aren't as I thought, right? We really, I have to say, we need this. I would argue we need this as much as ever in our educational institutions right now, because one of the things that's very strange right now, Jake, is everybody thinks they know everything. And whether you're on the right or the left, there's a sense, again, of this sort of knowing culture, right? As if all the answers are already there. Right. Again, to use the expression, I mean, I'll use it, I'll get myself in trouble here, but, to be woke, in that sense means, everybody else is unconscious, but you're woke. Well, look, I want to be woke too. But let's be clear, even the most woke people aren't as woke as they think. And even the most enlightened people are not as enlightened as they think. And most of these things are aspirational, right? And the idea of education is to open up that aspiration for people and to encourage them and invite them to try to realize the aspiration of learning to get towards the truth, right? The truth is rather elusive, but we try, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess picking up on that, right? The project of always teaching yourself and learning and evolving. One thing that I've certainly realized, having the benefit of a collegiate education and learning for people like you, and then going to Duke and Harvard where I went to college, one of the things I realized was that as great as those things are and as nice as they are to have as both educations and notches in your belt or credentials, the number one thing I learned, for which I'm the most grateful, is that my education was not even 5 or 10% where it needed to be when I graduated from college, when I graduated from high school. And for me, the last couple of years especially have been a process of updating everything and learning more. And I guess I'd be curious, is that, given the culture you're talking about right now, and I've certainly seen it myself, where everybody thinks they know everything and they don't question their beliefs. They don't feel like they need to have thought them through or have evidence, which by the way, is a thing that as an English teacher, right, you have to be able to back up your argument. There has to be textual evidence, as we learned at Collegiate.
Yeah.
Is that something you've seen change in your educational career? Do you think that students are about the same as they were on that 30 years ago, or have they gotten better or worse?
That's hard to say. I mean, it's actually very, very hard to say in a lot of ways. I don't know if they've gotten better or worse. You began that last comment with reference to a Socratic paradox, right? And the Socratic paradox, of course, which is at the center of Platonic philosophy, is Socrates saying the only thing I know for certain is that I know nothing, right? And there is a way in which the more you read, the more you come to know about stuff, the more you realize you haven't read, right? I mean, I've read a lot of books, okay? I really have read a lot of books, but there are so many books I haven't read and so many things that I don't know. And, one of the funny things about becoming a more educated person is actually having a little bit of humility about that, right? And being aware of all the things that you don't know and that you don't read. Jake, it's an interesting problem. The students that I have are still really, really good. The kids, I mean, if you give them really challenging things to read and you ask them to think and you show them an engagement with the material and with intellectual life, by and large, my experiences, they go with you. They go with you. The one thing that I think is very different about kids now from when I was a child, and this kind of cuts across, and it may just have been my group. I don't know, but I think a lot of times I think kids are less interested in knowing about all the stuff that came before right now, right? I'll say this, and this isn't just about literature. It's about music. It's about film. I don't know. It's like when I was a kid, I started to get into rock music, jazz music. I wanted to learn about where it came from. So I don't know. When I was in high school, I had an uncle who gave me jazz records. But I was listening to like Charlie Parker records from the 1940s. This is in the 70s. I was listening to Armstrong from the 20s.
Yeah.
I was learning about that stuff. I guess it's weird. I mean, this might have just been my bent. Even when I was a child, Jake, I got really into baseball. I was deep into baseball when I was a child. And I remember I lived in Detroit early on in my life, and I was a Tigers fan. And so, I remember reading like in third grade, biographies of Ty Cobb, the great, racist Georgia Peach, Detroit Tiger dude. It's like I read these old books about the old baseball players. Like I wanted to know the early culture. I wanted to know where things came from. I find that kids are less interested in that. Like they're not that interested, for instance, in watching the old movies. Jelinek, David Jelinek, who teaches art, he's really good at this, showing kids in art class, Hitchcock movies, old movies, whatever. And, their minds get blown because it's like, wow, like he shows them for instance, Vertigo or Rear Window by Hitchcock and they're like totally blown away, So, one of the things I think that's so difficult now is that the welter of information, there's so much information coming at you at all times. You got to have an opinion about everything. You got to know which influencer is which. You have to be up on every possible show. There are 9,000 cable TV channels, and it's impossible for certain kids to pull themselves back from the here and now, right? So I got myself in very, very hot water a few years ago when I claimed that ancient texts or classical texts are really old texts, merely by being old and ancient brought a kind of diversity to the curriculum. Because for me, that is a diversity, And I got myself even more trouble when I said, Jake, in a meeting that finally, okay, look, I understand Homer was a white male, right? I'm a white male. But I'm absolutely convinced I have far more in common culturally with Toni Morrison than I do with freaking Homer. I'm just convinced about that, and I think that's a historical argument, right? I mean, that culture is radically foreign to ours, right? So, I think that I'm really committed to teaching the old stuff, and I think it's fantastic for kids to be exposed.
Has your curriculum changed at all? Have you? So obviously, I took aesthetics with you, which as many, I don't know if you had this impression, but I think many students kind of knew it as your magnum opus as a collegiate course, where we read Plato, Aristotle.
Yeah. Look, that class is still really humming along, right? That is a super interesting project. Again, I'm indebted to that project to a professor that I had at Brown called Edward Ahern. He had a class called Complet 121 that I took in 1979, and the class I teach at Collegiate is kind of modeled on that. But what we do in that class is to we kind of do a little survey of the evolution of philosophical thinking about the work of art. We read Plato and Aristotle. We read Horace. We read Boccaccio, Edmund Burke, Philip Sidney, Nietzsche, Schiller, Shelley, Freud, etc. Kind of the old speculation on the work of art, starting with the Greeks, coming up through the Renaissance, coming into Romanticism, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and then up into modernism. And then, we spend the entire semester reading one novel, about 30 pages at a time, right? And I do think, Jake, I think that class, I'm very proud of that class. I think that class allows, as I say, it kind of furnishes for kids. It gives them a kind of toolbox, gives them a lot of concepts that they can use. It's an introduction to the evolution of Western thinking about the work of art. So that class hasn't really changed much in terms of the philosophy. But it's interesting. When I started teaching the class, I taught Madame Bovary as the master literary text.
Yeah.
Then I switched it up and I taught Lolita. And you were in the class that we taught Lolita. I did that for maybe 7 or 8 years. Why did I do that? Well, I did that because I moved the Flaubert into a 19th century novel class, and I just didn't want to make it redundant. So I figured I would, And Lolita has a lot of things, right? That is to say, there's a lot to talk about there. It is a deeply appalling book in so many different ways, but it's also an unbelievably great book, it seems to me. And as I tried to make clear to you, despite Nabokov's protestations, the book really finally is about the tragedy of solipsism, and it's about the monstrosity of Humbert, right?
Absolutely.
Of course, he's playing a very interesting game because the whole first half of the novel, he seduces you to kind of root for Humbert as he's trying to do the worst possible things to this poor waif of a girl. Look, reading that with kids, I mean, it's just fantastic because it's like, it just challenges every possible notion of what a literary text ought to be. And again, it's funny. I wanted to teach it a long time ago at Collegiate, and my department head, Susan Fine, said, "Oh, she didn't think this was a good idea because somehow, white male teaching to a bunch of white, largely white male kids a book about this, kind of refined European rapist probably isn't the best idea." But look, I eventually put it in, and it was great. I mean, it worked incredibly well. Kids were deeply into it, and I think I taught it really. I think I taught it really well, and I think I taught it with a great deal of integrity, really, for all kinds of reasons, trying to really reckon with the tragedy at the heart of that book. And the tragedy cuts both ways because it's about the ruination of 2 lives. But I gotta admit that 2 years ago, I just thought to myself, or a year and a half, I just thought, maybe I shouldn't teach this because, given the winds right now, I just thought, one day I'm going to get in trouble. One day there's going to be the sense. And it's very interesting. It's not just me. I will tell you that Jared Lister, who's my young colleague, he was talking to a guy called Ross Posnock, who teaches at Columbia. I think he might be the chair of the English department now at Columbia.
Columbia Prep, the high school, not university.
No, Columbia University. Yeah. Because Jared, he's one of the people that Jared worked with at Columbia University. Jared's finishing up PhD there. Anyway, but he said that right now he would not. He used to always teach that book in an undergraduate class. He said he would never teach this book.
Really?
Yeah, because again, there's just the sense somehow that. Somehow if you teach a book that in some ways you espouse it's apparent ideology. And again, what can I tell you? I mean, it's like, look, in the satire class, I teach Juvenal. I mean, that dude is the worst. He's like the worst human being I can possibly imagine, Juvenal. I mean, he's a homophobe, misogynist, anti-Semite, raging conservative, reactionary asshole of the first order. I mean, he's horrible. But at the same time, there is a kind of magnificent creativity in his rants. there's a whole symptomatology in the book of the decay of the Roman aristocracy, and indeed the political decay of a Roman world that is really falling apart. And it's unbelievably interesting to read. I mean, it kind of makes you nauseous, but it's incredibly interesting to read, right? So, this idea that we only need to choose, we should teach only books, the writers of which are impeccably ethical, and the messages of which are sort of simply tolerant and democratic. It's a very reductive idea of what you should be doing as an English teacher, because a lot of times what you should be doing is reading stuff that's quite abhorrent and then trying to figure out why it's abhorrent, right? I mean, there's a lot to do, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely, it does. And I think that's also something Montaigne said on the education of children, that it's not enough to hold an idea to be self-evident. It's not enough to know that something's wrong just because you've been told it. You have to own it yourself and
That's
know
right.
at a level of being able to reason it.
Yeah, I think that's really, really, really right. And that's the mark, it seems to me, of good liberal education, right? In the sense of freeing up the mind to deal with arguments and to find its footing, on its own terms. I mean, that seems to me to be very important. So, to your question, I mean, look, it's a very, very interesting problem now, because what can I say? I like to teach the old books. Why do I like to teach old books? Well, because there have been a lot of debates that have gone down over time, over history. They're very rich. There's a process, it seems to me, Jake, of sifting. And these works that come down to us, Whitman describes it in The American Business. They come down like boats from the ancient world. They kind of arrive in our harbor. They're there for a reason, right? So, look, I want to keep doing that. Our 10th grade curriculum, which is a kind of version, sort of like a junior version of the Columbia Great Books program, or DS at Yale, it is, for lack of a better term, a great books program, and it's kind of, what can I say? We teach Homer, we teach the Odyssey, we teach Sophocles, Antigone and Oedipus the King, Aristotle's Poetics. So we get, as I like to say here, Jake, to my mind, we get two of the three most influential Greek writers, Homer, Sophocles, and Aeschylus, I would argue, Euripides being perhaps the other one. But we get two of those, and then we read the selections from the Canterbury Tales, and we read Shakespeare, and we read some Milton. And again, traditionally, the three kind of great sort of fathers of English literature, and I use that word advisedly, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton.
Right.
And then we read Jane Austen, right? And we used to read Faulkner. When you were there, we read As I Lay Dying, right? But
I have to ask you about that, because I recently read The Sound and the Fury, which I found to be far superior, but maybe that's just me.
Well, Sound and Fury is probably, I mean, it's probably a more substantial book in all kinds of ways, more difficult, and I don't know that it would necessarily work in our curriculum. The As I Lay Dying is so compact, but we switched that out. We put in Song of Solomon for all the obvious reasons, and it's been good in all kinds of ways. I mean, the book. Well, look, we have Jane Austen as your 19th century traditional literature novel, and then we have Toni Morrison as a kind of relatively contemporary novel. You get a little bit of a sense of the flexibility of the genre. You get a different voice. You get a different kind of character in Milkman and the whole milieu that he has in his life. And the book also references Homer in all kinds of interesting ways, and kind of doubles back to the beginning of the year. So so it's been pretty good. That being said, there's a lot of clamoring in certain circles, that the curriculum really should be sort of largely dismantled, and that we should make it more quote unquote representative.
Right.
And again, I've been fighting that battle now for a good, 7 or 8 years, because I think that's a very bad idea, to dismantle this curriculum. That's not to say you can't evolve it, but there's all kinds of ways that we can evolve it. But I think it is fantastic for kids to be exposed to Homer and Milton and these really old writers. And the other thing, of course, is that if they're not exposed in high school, they'll never ever be exposed in college, because most kids aren't going to do this. And again, if you look at what the MLA, which is the Association of University Professors, they did a survey a few years back about what's being taught in universities. And, the horizon is relentlessly presentist. It's like 3/4 of the classes, maybe more, 20th century, 21st century literature, right? I ran into a woman, I met this woman a couple years back at Columbia. She's a Dickens specialist, and she tried to teach Dickens course. Nobody signed up. And so she's teaching a course on film, so, what can I say? I think it's probably good. It's probably good to read Dickens. So that's where I stand on that. That makes me, look, I'm 59. I'm an aging dude, aging white dude, trained up in a program at Berkeley that was kind of the most philological, that is to say, was most invested in learning traditions, the most in the country for sure. And, all that stuff has influenced how I think about literature and how I think about the whole enterprise of teaching.
And there's one omission in the curriculum you just mentioned that stuck out to me. And I don't know if it's because it's not taught anymore. When I was in 10th grade, so that would have been 8 years ago now, we actually did read Huckleberry Finn in sophomore English.
You read that in 9th grade. That was in 9th grade. Always in 9th grade. Yeah.
I
guarantee you, because I've been teaching.
Positive it was 10th, and the only reason I can tell you that is that I distinctly remember reading it with Dr. Beale, and I only had him sophomore year in high school.
You did not read it with Dr. Beale, I promise you. Because I know I've been teaching 2 sections of that class for 27 years.
No, I mean, I'm gonna have to agree. I could pull the essays. I'll do it another time. I'll send them to you. But
well, he might have taught you in 9th. The court. Did he teach you in 9th grade or not?
No. And I had him sophomore English, and I distinctly remember Huckleberry Finn with him. I remember, Dr. Beale is famous for the Duke and the Dauphin, the kind of way he does the play. I mean,
right. Well, I will tell you that book. Last year, that book is now out of the 9th grade curriculum.
As of last year.
Correct.
As of last year, and that was in response to a letter that some students wrote suggesting that it be changed.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, and
right.
Look, it's a very, very complicated issue. I understand. Look, we have to think about the situation at our school. We have to think about the situation at Collegiate. I mean, again, the school, Jake, in terms of representation of African Americans, Black students, it has gone backward rather than forward. Right? 20 years ago, undoubtedly, 20 years ago. Oh, undoubtedly. We had more students. We had more Black students and more Hispanic students than we do now. We have more students of color because our student body has diversified tremendously with East Asian, South Asian kids. I mean, we have, we look quite diverse. I'll tell you, it's very funny because when we went on the music trips back with Rudishauser, we did those music trips to Europe. I remember when we rolled into Spain, we looked like the United Nations. I mean, we had redheaded Irish kids and kind of curly-haired Jewish kids and Chinese kids and Indian kids and Black kids. And it was quite amazing. But the world, the independent schools in New York City are having a lot of trouble right now in the post. George Floyd moment, because in fact, I think many of them have actually moved backwards. So, the point that was made by my colleagues is that if you're like the only Black kid in the class and you've got the N-word every other page in Huck Finn, somehow, it's difficult and you feel somewhat assailed.
That makes sense.
And I get that. I mean, obviously any reading of that book is going to have to understand that, what's so kind of revolutionary about it is the surprise that Huck has, and I think that Twain himself had in the development of Jim, right? Because, the story is, he sets out to write another kid book a la Tom Sawyer, and something quite different happens. So, I understand that the book has all kinds of racist moments, the hairball oracle at the beginning, even at the end, there's all kinds of stuff that's problematic. But the meat of the book, of course, is the relationship between Jim and Huck and the development of Jim as this kind of astonishingly thought out and deep and well-rounded human character, right? So, I would argue that the essence of that book is actually quite anti-racist, and that
absolutely,
that's how it ought to be taught. That said, the language is such, the culture is such. Maybe it's too hard. I'm not teaching the book, so when the people in the 9th grade say they want to remove it, it's like, okay, it's your call. Again, I think generally, Jake, I don't think you do. I don't think we do the students of our country much of a service by not having them read Huck Finn, because the book is fantastically influential. Hemingway said every book afterwards, basically derives from Huck Finn. Look, it's a fantastic thing to read. And it's unbelievably interesting. And it's precisely interesting because it brings up so many questions, right? I like to brag a little, but I read that book for the first time in fourth grade. I still have the
Fourth
same.
grade.
And in fourth grade, and I wrote my little name, and I had a very hard time. I remember understanding, figuring out the dialect.
Right.
I remember, when Jim says he's going to do something, it's spelled GWYN.
Right.
I had a hard time in fourth grade. I read it in fourth grade, and I signed my name on my book. And then I read it again in eighth grade, and then I read it again in 11th grade, and then I read it in college. So, I've read that book a lot, and it was an incredibly formative thing for me to read that book. It taught me an unbelievable amount about this country. And people are going to say, "Oh, well, there's lots of other books you could read." Oh, yeah, there are, but there are very few that have the kind of force and the kind of influence that Huck Finn has had. And that's why, again, I don't think you do students a service in not teaching the book. I feel pretty strongly about that. That being said, since I'm not teaching it and I'm not in that class and I don't know what it's like to be a student calling that class, I said, your decision. Whatever.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's a good thing that students have input on things like that, and that I like that at the school they feel comfortable voicing how they feel. I think that's a good thing. And to the point about Huck Finn, and like you said about Lin-Manuel Miranda earlier in Hamilton, both of those works are obviously evidence of the transformative power that literature or other works of art can have. And I think that's one of the takeaways of everything you read, right? I don't know quite what the reception of Lolita was like in the 1950s, but I have to imagine, I know it was considered to be so scandalous that on the movie poster that Kubrick did, it said, "How did they make a movie out of that?" or something like that.
Yeah. Well, it was what the French call a succès scandale, which is to say it was a success because it was so scandalous, right? And I think it was a book that was more often bought than read, right? It became a big bestseller, and Nabokov made a crap load of money from it, right? And it's an interesting story, because he came, of course, from a very, very, very wealthy aristocratic family. Lived in that unbelievable palatial house in St. Petersburg, and he was 17 when the revolution started to happen. And his family went down to Odessa, and they were white Russians, and they thought sure they would be coming back, that things would fail, And he left at 17, never went back, right? He went off to Cambridge and studied literature at Cambridge, and did a lot of translating. He translated Alice in Wonderland into Russian while he was at Cambridge. What can I say? Incredibly interesting itinerary that he had. I forget what was I saying? I forget where I was at the beginning of that. But
about the transformative power and the reception of things like
the reception. Right, there you go. I'm sorry, I was thinking about that. So the point is, when he got to the States, he went. Thank you very much. You're very good. You're an excellent podcast host here.
Thank you.
The point is, when he was used to having a lot of money. He lived in rather penurious circumstances in Berlin, and then when he came to the States, he ended up becoming a university professor finally at Cornell, and made some money as a university professor. But he really made a bunch of money when he wrote Lolita, and then he quit being a university professor and eventually moved back to Switzerland and lived, I think, in some luxury towards the end of his life, right? So again, that book, of course, is so canny because, he says he has that whole preface from John Ray Jr. making fun of the idea that, it should raise any social issues or, there's that wonderful thing will be of interest to psychologists and social workers, and everyone concerned with child welfare. And he's mocking, So, I don't exactly know what to tell you about that in terms of what it might have done, right? Nabokov, of course, would be very, very resistant to any kind of discourse of the efficacy of literature, right? His whole point would be that literature makes nothing happen, and other than its own kind of aesthetic performance. And for him, and he writes about this brilliantly in Speak Memory, that aesthetic performance, when he talks about getting the tingle down your spine when something's really good, for him, that's the divine moment. That's the great moment of literature. That's what he's most interested in.
Yeah, I would just, well, it's been sitting at the top of my list for a long time, Speak Memory. I have, like many people, I'm sure, I've read the first paragraph of it, The Cradle Rocks Above the Abyss. That is, I have to say, one of the most beautiful
It's
paragraphs.
incredible. It's an incredible. That's one of the great autobiographies. It really is worth reading. It's a fantastic thing. It's a fantastic.
I'll get there eventually. But again, and as you're saying, I wish I had the exact quote accessible to me right now, but it's something like, a work of literature for me exists only insofar as it imparts to me a sense of aesthetic bliss.
Yeah, that's it. That's what that's that idea of a tingle. Yeah, he talks about that. He talks about that in the afterword to Lolita. That's exactly.
And how do you, as a teacher, how do you strike it's an interesting dichotomy, right? Because on the one hand, as Mr. Child, another colleague of yours, was fond of saying, and I really appreciated as a student of his, a poem should not mean but be. As English students, we can get too into the weeds of analysis and metaphor, simile, and kind of structural ideas behind a book. On the other hand, though, there's some level at which something can just be beautiful. Something can just excite you, like you're saying.
Right. Well, again, the whole enterprise of the aesthetics class is to try to figure out the bridge between that sense of beauty and then the obligations of discourse, right? Because what you want to do is you want to be able to have that experience of the beauty and an experience of astonishment. Aristotle says, and I think it's a really wonderful idea, that the fundamental thing the philosopher has to have is the ability to be astonished, right? That word in Greek is thaumazein, and you need to be able to be astonished. And if your astonishment is the beginning of knowledge, right? So I'm very interested, Jake, in the bridge from that moment of aesthetic bliss or astonishment and then into language so that we can try to describe that experience or share that experience or describe the stakes of that experience for each other, right? We're kind of condemned to language in that way, right? Because we can experience something, but then if we want to impart to others what that's about, well, we have to use language, unless we're going to use another art form, right? I think about music, for instance. Part of the fun of music when you're really into something is you just play it for another person, and the other person kind of gets it or not. And in a way, with something like music, you don't necessarily always need language. Thelonious Monk, the jazz pianist who I just love, he talked about the absurdity of music criticism, and he had this great line. He said, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. That was his line, which I just think is a fantastic line. That in some ways the best music criticism would be other kinds of music. But when we're talking about literature, literary criticism, it happens in language, right? Sure, a poem should not mean but be. I guess the poem has to be first, but insofar as it is, and insofar as it produces an affect, well, then it's also going to be. Right? And things are always meaning. Roland Barthes talks about that again in Writing Degree Zero, his first book. He says actually, literature becomes most meaningful. This is interesting when it tries to actually refuse meaning, and that's when it actually becomes the most. That's sort of. I mean, we get back to Lolita there.
Kind of the gambit, right? When Nabokov starts something like that, he obviously is being somewhat tongue in cheek.
That's right. That's really right. And look, training people into the questions about tongue-in-cheek, questions of irony, complexities of utterance. These are all the things that we English teachers want to inculcate in our students. And the thing about it, Jake, is look, the need to be able to, the need for irony, the need for mental flexibility, the need for complexity of thought. That's a real need right now because we live in a world of extraordinarily reductive discourse. And again, I would claim that on the left and the right. Just unbelievably reductive in so many ways. And part of that is the problem of Twitter. It's very, very difficult to have much tonal complexity when you're, limited to whatever it is, 180 characters.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very gravely reduced form of discourse. And obviously our president has used it to unbelievably destructive effect. Actually trying to inculcate in students a habit of mind, of being attentive to complexity, to irony, to meaning that can't simply be reduced to what we call in the literary critical field univocal, to its kind of univocal meaning, univocal, only having one meaning. The most interesting kinds of literature most often have multiple meanings. In fact, in some ways, Jake, this is one of the things. The whole brief of the great books class is to show that that the books I think that have been the most influential, I would argue the books that have been the most influential in the Western canon are most often fundamentally at war with themselves, right? Go to Milton, for instance, right? Milton says he's justifying the ways of God to men. And then he writes a book in which essentially, Satan is so charismatic and so fantastic, and God is so boring and dogmatic that it appears that he's doing exactly the opposite. Now, there have been a lot of arguments about what's at stake here, right? Because again, Stanley Fish, who made a very famous argument in the 60s, which is the idea basically that Milton is setting a kind of trap and getting the reader to kind of fall in love with Satan, or at least to admire Satan, just as Eve does. And that just as Eve is, as the book title has it, surprised by sin, so it is that the reader is surprised by a kind of sin. So he says ultimately Milton does justify the ways of God to man, that the book actually does end up espousing that position. But, Blake and the Romantics before that said that he does exactly the opposite thing, right? So all I'm saying is that, to claim that book, reduces to one simple kind of meaning is to miss the whole point of the book. The book is energized by the internal war that it has. You look at the Iliad. I mean, you could read the Iliad as the greatest poem in favor of war or the greatest anti-war poem that's ever written. You go either way. I mean, we teach Henry IV, Part 1. You could look at it, Henry. You could look at it finally as espousing kind of, Freudian renunciation of id, pleasure, in the name of obligation, as the prince gives up his pleasures in the tavern and takes on responsibility. Or you could read it as Falstaff. You could read on the side of Falstaff as an absolute critique of the uselessness of that very gesture, right? So, what I love about the old books is, again, the ambivalence and complexity. Jane Austen, if you look at Pride and Prejudice, I mean, lots of people will read that as, a kind of progressive critique of social relations and a kind of proto-feminist book. Other people are going to say, look, finally, it just reinscribes the gentry. It reinscribes marriage. It's totally normatively heterosexual. It doesn't actually do much, right? So, I don't know. I mean, it's in those trenches, Jake. It's in those trenches of meaning that the books live, right? And that's why it's cool to read them, right? I'm thoroughly uninterested in reading books that offer a very, very simple moral position and teach children to be better people. I look. This is like, I suppose this is the most complex of all the ideas and the most difficult to articulate. But Jake, just as it is the case, with great literature, that the great literature, great art can never put its moral message first. It always has to come in the back door. It's the same thing with teaching. If you choose books because you think they're just going to make kids better citizens, because you think they're going to make them nicer people. I'm talking about literature here. You really reduce what you're doing. You're not teaching. You're not doing literary study. You're doing social work. Look, I want society to be better. I want my kids to be good people. I want them to be engaged with life of the mind. I want them to be good citizens. But I don't think of what I'm doing as first and foremost social work. I think teaching literature is not social work. It's teaching literature. It's a different thing.
Did you ever teach any Dostoevsky?
I teach Notes from Underground, which is, you talk about a book that's at war with itself. It's incredible.
I never knew that you taught that, because I read it last year by myself. Really a tragedy that I never got to read that with you, because I have to say that to me was you would know the history of this better than I would, but that is one of the most stunningly modern protagonists in literature I've ever read. And that was
totally right.
1860.
Yeah, totally right about that. 1850s. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. No. You're absolutely right about that. Again, I love that book. I mean, I read that book in grad school in a satire class. So when I got my own satire class together, I guess you didn't take that. Maybe I wasn't. Yeah, the thing about teaching these classes, you kind of you teach them for a bunch of years, and then you kind of get sick of hearing yourself talk about them. So it may have been that I just wasn't teaching the satire class when you were there. But that book. I mean, look. That protagonist is recognized as kind of one of the stunningly sort of modern figures, right? And the kind of infinite loop, the recursive loop of consciousness and self-hatred, and it's fantastic. And it gets funnier the more you read it, the funnier it gets. I think it's just a fantastic book. So yeah.
simultaneously the most pathetic person ever, yet also one of the most sympathetic. I mean,
yes. And very, very smart.
Absolutely. But and somehow self-aware, yet entirely incapable of fixing anything or doing anything that doesn't eventually hurt himself. He's if Larry David were plucked out of his time and stuck in mid 19th century Russia, that's basically who you'd have.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. The difference, of course, is that Larry David was very fortunate because he lived in a time in which that kind of posture of the absolute sort of misanthropic, self-hating, super intelligent character, could produce George Costanza, and
Right.
then you could, he ends up, of course, being an unbelievably wealthy individual, whereas the Underground Man's rants are incredibly funny and wonderful, but nobody wants to hear them. So he lives. He lives in his little basement, in the most pathetic of possible ways. No, it's really great. I really do love teaching that text. It's a fantastic thing.
It's kind of amazing to me too, the relationship between that Dostoevsky. I've read one of his books. I read in a philosophy class in college, but Notes from Underground and Crime and Punishment, which I read recently, I kind of did on my own. But the kind of continuous undercurrent, the problem of nihilism that I see him as kind of trying to face, is really incredible. And the way in which it connects between Ivan Karamazov and the sort of ideological battle between the three brothers.
Yeah.
And then I guess if you want to call it the four too, which if that spoils it for anyone, that Smerdyakov is, I'm sorry, it's 150 years later. That's your fault. And then obviously Rodion Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. They're all kind of cut from the same cloth.
Yeah. Well, that was a real type at the time, right? In Russian society, Russian society was going through this kind of extraordinary moment where serfdom was ending. The serfs were emancipated in 1861. Our slaves were emancipated in 1863. The whole question of belief and the question of the church and the question of what kind of ideology Russia was going to espouse becomes unbelievably pitched, and you have a whole series of novels that are dealing with these nihilistic characters. If you're interested in that figure, the other one, and I haven't read the book in a long time, so I can't really speak of it off the top of my head, but Turgenev's book, Fathers and Sons, there's a character called Bazarov, who is the charismatic nihilist. And, the paradox of Bazarov, of course, is that, he's unbelievably passionately connected to his belief that there's no meaning, right? His belief that so there's something deeply compelling about him. Oscar Wilde in The Decay of Lying, which you read with me, he refers to him, talks about the paradox of the nihilist, because you would think that if you believe that there is no meaning or no rationale to our existence, that you wouldn't be passionately committed to that belief.
That is quite a paradox. Yeah. I mean, look, those are all really incredible, and that's always been my kind of that's been my preference too, to go backwards rather than I don't read too many current things, honestly. I prefer the older stuff as well.
Yeah, well, look, it's great. I want to make this clear, and I want to make this very, very clear. It's great to read contemporary things and to be on top of them. I just read this book by Ocean Vuong on Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, Vietnamese book by a young gay Vietnamese writer. It's a fantastic book. I thought the book was great. There's all kinds of fantastic things that are being written right now, right? And I want to make it clear that my position with respect to English education is not at all, Jake, that there's no great contemporary literature, because I actually think there are fantastic things being done all the time. It's just my point would be that because these books come out, they haven't accrued the language, the discourse, the history that the older books have. I think as objects of instruction, finally, they're less interesting. They're less compelling, we don't have the history of criticism. We don't have the history of response, to use your phrase, the reception, use your word. We don't have those things. So consequently, the experience in the classroom is going to be somewhat impoverished, right? So again, it's not, in my case, it's not making a dig saying, oh, it's no reason you should read contemporary literature. No, read a lot of contemporary literature. It's just, my point would be, encourage kids to read contemporary literature. And teach the classics. Don't
throw out the old stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so we'll see. I mean, look, we'll see how it all shakes out. That position is increasingly a minority position. there's all kinds of pressure from all kinds of places to decanonize, but again, look, I understand. Like Milton, what can I say? I mean, Milton was an extraordinary. I mean, the book is filled with misogyny. There's no doubt about it. But in some ways, Eve really is the hero of the book. Stephen Greenblatt, who you may have studied with at Harvard. Stephen Greenblatt.
But I've read some stuff he's written.
Okay, so Stephen Greenblatt just read a book. Now, again, I only read an excerpt from it. I've not read the whole book. He just read a whole book on versions of Eve. And he makes the claim that Eve really is finally the hero of Paradise Lost, and that the presentation of Eve is just fantastically complex and human and super interesting, right? So, all I'm saying again is that we must not fall prey to this reductionism in which we take for granted what an author thinks he's doing, or to look only at the surface of the language, and because certain things are said that are, how shall I say, frowned on nowadays, that we must kind of consign the book to oblivion. I like to say this, Jake, if the world is still around, which I hope obviously it will be 300 years from now, they're going to look back at us and they're going to say some pretty incredible things. They're going to say, look, these people, they thought they were so, wonderfully woke and so advanced. And, everybody's walking around with iPhones that have rare earth metals that are mined by children in the Congo, who are all dying as a result of this, horrible. I mean, we are all implicated, right? My friend said, it's interesting, and I'm speaking as somebody who, it's not like I eat a massive amount of meat, but I eat meat. My friend was saying a couple hundred years, they'll probably look back at us and say, can you imagine, like, those people were eating other mammals? That's probably right, it seems to me. Like, we probably will get to the point where that's seen as barbarous, you know what I'm saying? So all I'm saying is that what I don't like is the sense that somehow we are the most enlightened people ever, and nobody's ever been enlightened like we are. That position is really fucking crazy, and it needs to be combated at all times, it seems to me.
That is about as good a stopping point as any as I can think of. So let me just say thank you so much for doing this, and hopefully we'll do it again in the future.
Okay, my pleasure.